In 2003, we saw the release of the incredible Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb. And now, over 2 decades later, we have the release of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. But what exactly has changed over these last 20 years when it comes to attention to detail? So in this video, guys, we're going to be doing a direct comparison of the brand new Indiana Jones and the Great Circle versus Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb from 2003, and I hope you guys enjoy this direct comparison as much as I've enjoyed making it for you guys. And if you do enjoy the video, maybe consider liking the video, and if you really enjoy the video, maybe even consider subscribing as well. It means a lot, but guys, let's dive into the video. So diving right in, the first difference you'll notice between the Emperor's Tomb and the Great Circle is that the Emperor's Tomb is played entirely in third person. While in the Great Circle, the gameplay is predominantly set in first person, though there are certain actions that Indy can do that bring the camera out to the third person perspective. And when putting these actions side by side, the graphical enhancements over the last 20 years are quite staggering. And moving on now to a comparison of Indy himself between the two games, and in the Emperor's Tomb, Indy is voiced by David Esch, who does a pretty good job impersonating Harrison Ford.
Beyond the city lies the Temple of the Black River Goddess, and inside, the idol of Kuruwatu. I'm close now.
And the character model for Indy is pretty impressive for a game that came out in 2003. Whereas in the Great Circle, Indy is voiced by Troy Baker, who does a damn near perfect impersonation of a younger Harrison Ford.
Easy, pal.
And with these modern graphics that look so impressive, it looks as if 1981 Raiders of the Lost Ark Indy has stepped off the screen and into the game.
Better than being a Nazi.
And it wouldn't be an Indiana Jones game without his signature whip, as it appears in both games and has multiple uses, including traversal. In the Emperor's Tomb, Indy can use his whip to swing across gaps, though the swing itself happens automatically and you don't have that much control over it. While in the Great Circle, obviously you can do this here as well, though you have much more control over how you swing on your whip to the point to where you can actually miss the jump. Not to mention you can use your whip to free climb to high places or even climb straight up the side of a flat surface. Ultimately, the whip traversal in the Great Circle has much more flexibility than what we saw in the Emperor's Tomb. And of course, Indy's whip can be used for combat as well, as in the Great Circle you can use your whip to disarm enemies or even whip somebody and yank them towards you into a grapple where you can then engage in hand-to-hand combat. But one thing I find really impressive about the Emperor's Tomb is that when it comes to whip combat, almost everything you can do in the Great Circle you can do in the Emperor's Tomb. Using your whip to disarm enemies or even yanking them into a grapple is something you could do in the Emperor's Tomb all the way back in 2003. I just find it really interesting that even after 20 years of gameplay innovation, the Emperor's Tomb's whip combat actually holds its own against the Great Circles. Another thing I found really interesting is that Indiana Jones' signature hat has a few gameplay differences between the two games as well, as in the Emperor's Tomb, whenever you get into hand-to-hand combat, there's a chance whenever you take damage that your hat can get knocked off, leaving you to have to go back and pick it up after the fight. And while the Great Circle doesn't necessarily have this, they do have a pretty neat perk called Lucky Hat, where if your health falls below 0, you then fall to the ground, and if you can find your hat fast enough and re-equip it, you get another chance at life. And moving on now to a comparison of the game's combat, and one thing that really impressed me about the Emperor's Tomb is that even all the way back in 2003, this game's hand-to-hand combat was absolutely fantastic. But most importantly, it highlights the improvisational nature of Indiana Jones in a fistfight. For example, if an enemy has a weapon, you can knock that weapon out of their hand during the fight, and then the fight can turn into a scramble of who can pick up that weapon first to use it against their enemy, while also showing that Indy isn't invincible and can get his ass kicked too. It's a lot of fun. But this is taken to a whole new level in the Great Circle, as every punch has so much weight and impact behind it, and the sound effects are absolutely perfect. And I swear, even now, after beating the game, I'm still finding new combos in the combat. The game also does a really good job of leaning into Indiana Jones' improvisational combat skills by using whatever weapons are on hand. But at the end of the day, you can't deny just how satisfying those knockout punches are in the Great Circle. And when it comes to a comparison of the firearms, of course Indy has his trusty revolver, though in the Emperor's Tomb, whenever it comes to aiming the revolver, you don't actually get to aim the weapon yourself, he just automatically aims at whatever enemy is most directly in front of him. And if enemies get too close, you can use your revolver as a melee weapon. Whereas in the Great Circle, of course you have more control of where you're aiming the revolver in first person, though I did notice when shooting the enemies in Great Circle, you actually are leaving blood decals on the enemies that you're shooting. Though I do wish the revolver was a bit more powerful. Though I do love you can still use the revolver in close quarters combat, though in the Great Circle he flips it upside down so he can bash them with the handle instead.
Fair and square.
And of course there's other larger two-handed firearms that you can use between both games that are much more powerful than your revolver, but one thing I love about the Great Circle is that you can then, just like the revolver, flip the weapons upside down and use them as melee weapons to the point where they break. Though your time with these more powerful weapons is limited, as anytime you go to use a ladder or a zip line, the game forces you to drop your weapon. Whereas in the Emperor's Tomb, these larger firearms are still in the game, though you don't have to give them up, as you can actually store the weapons on your back and carry them throughout the entire level. Not to mention, you can still use these firearms as a melee weapon. Moving on to another pretty big difference between the two games, and it's actually how healing works, as in the Great Circle, anytime Indiana Jones gets injured, you can actually heal yourself with a bandage, or you can fortify your health by eating food that you find throughout the different locations. Whereas in the Emperor's Tomb, the way Indiana Jones heals himself is actually by drinking water that is stored in his flask. And throughout each level, you have to keep your eyes open for places where you can refill your flask so that you can heal yourself in case you get injured. But in my opinion, one of the biggest differences between these two games is when it comes to player choice. Whereas in the Emperor's Tomb, if you walk into a room that's full of enemies, you know that you're going to have to brawl with them in order to clear the area. While in the Great Circle, the players have a lot more choices on how they want to handle these encounters. Do you go in guns blazing and brawling everybody like in the Emperor's Tomb, or do you engage with the game's actually really well fleshed out stealth where you're causing distractions by throwing objects, or just sneaking around knocking everybody out?
Nice and easy.
Or just sneaking past everyone entirely. Though I do have to admit, I do love sneaking up behind people and just gently pushing them over ledges.
Adios, pal!
But I love you can still throw people over the ledge in combat in Emperor's Tomb, so that's pretty cool. I also noticed some weird differences when it comes to interacting with water between the two games, as in the Great Circle, obviously you can swim in that game, though they don't have any kind of animation for Indiana Jones leaving the water, as it's just kind of this janky motion of him going from swimming to standing on his feet, and I don't know why they didn't put any kind of animation there. Whereas here in the Emperor's Tomb, obviously the game's in third person, so they had to animate something, though I did notice one thing that's pretty cool is that Indiana Jones swims with his hat off in this game, though whenever he climbs out of the water, he puts his hat back on, which is a pretty cool touch. And with this next comparison, I wanted to compare the explosion effects from an Indiana Jones game from 2003, and as you can see in the Emperor's Tomb, it looks pretty good. Versus the exact same thing in the Great Circle. Yeah, that looks pretty damn good. Well guys, you made it to the end. Thank you for watching this direct comparison of the brand new Indiana Jones in the Great Circle versus Indiana Jones in the Emperor's Tomb. And guys, I know graphically, when it comes to comparing these two games, the Great Circle is going to win every single time. It's a brand new AAA game that came out this year, and the Emperor's Tomb came out in 2003. So graphically, Great Circle is going to win every single time. But the real reason why I love making these direct comparison videos is I love seeing how these games have changed and evolved when it comes to attention to detail over the course of years, or with this comparison, over the course of decades. And so I love seeing how these games have changed over the years, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video as well. But guys, that's all I have. If you found yourself liking the video, be sure to drop a like on it. It helps the video reach new fans, and as I always say, that's always a great thing. And I also make new videos like the one you're watching right now every single week, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. But guys, that's all I have, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya. And Merry Christmas as well.